All right, welcome to another podcast from Mr. Bouchard's IB class. Today we are looking at the hemispheric reaction, basically the Western Hemisphere's reaction to the events that were happening in Europe. We're going to start, though, let's start right here, looking at this cartoon here, going back all the way to talking about how the United States decided not to join the treaty or the League of Nations by ratifying the Treaty of Versailles. You can see that this is the Titanic trying to navigate foreign relations, which will be impossible to stay away from foreign treaties, foreign entanglements, and that the U.S. is heading into troubled waters. So let's talk about this reaction to World War I. Right away, looking at World War I in the U.S. The U.S. entered World War I on the side of the Allies. Had over 400,000 casualties, and pretty much from that, people felt the war was a mistake and do not want to get into another conflict. Also happened because of the influenza, and the Red Scare. People felt like it was time to move on. Therefore rejected the League of Nations because they felt it would drag the U.S. into another conflict overseas. Most people in the United States thought it was a mistake because this turned out, instead of being a different type of war, the war to end all wars, it was another war where Europe was going for land and money and other things that they had been continuing to fight of, and why the United States has stayed out of it. Treaty of Versailles, Japanese reaction. Japan tried to include a clause on racial equality, but the leaders of the Western power at Paris, Wilson among them, were unwilling to support such a declaration. Colonialism was still dependent upon the notion of the superiority of the white race, so to say that Japan and all races are equal to the whites would kind of go against what they're saying. And Japan wasn't looking for equal rights. They basically wanted Japan to be considered one of the major powers of the world, and felt like because of this lack of equality that they weren't given that same, they weren't looked at by the white countries as a true power. Germans' reactions, just the clause 231, which blamed Germany for war, that the soldier sent to sign the treaty refused to sign it, to say such a thing would be a lie. He said Clause 231 did not physically harm Germany, but it hurt Germany's pride, and it was this, as much as anything else, that made them want to overturn the treaty. The disgraceful treaty is being signed today. Don't forget it. We will never stop until we win back what we deserve. Wilson's fear that if one country is blamed, that they won't stop until they can avenge themselves, and that seems to come true here. Although from 1920 to 1941 for the United States was a period of peace. The 10 years before the 9 years before 1929 was also prosperous, but we can't say the whole time was prosperous. The United States made a couple efforts because it did not join the League to work. The Washington Naval Conference in 1921 set limits on how many ships you could build. Japan agreed to this, but some people in Japan were angry because they were given the lowest ratio of ships they could build, and this kind of furthered this anti-West, anti-American sentiment within Japan. There was a militaristic group in Japan's government that really felt like unless Japan armed itself and defeated these other countries in battle, that they would never respect Japan. And so the United States and Great Britain and France kind of proved that true by putting them definitely at the lowest ratio of capital ships, despite the fact that they had a pretty impressive navy. Okay. The way we're going to approach this is also wanted to say that in the 1930s, it's important to look that the United States in 1929, basically because of the Depression, had a preoccupation with its own needs and really did not pay attention to the to a lot that was going on until much later in the decade, between 1930 and 1940. The Kellogg-Briand Pact was a pact that the United States organized and had other countries come and sign it. It outlawed war and was followed by a similar pact between Germany and its neighbors, with this idea that war was not a valid foreign policy and that we need to find other ways to settle disagreements. It's basically the idea of the League of Nations, but wasn't. And oftentimes, because of lack of enforcement, this was a policy that basically stated that everybody agrees that war should not be a valid, but it doesn't necessarily add to that thing. Okay, so here we got a stoplight, because basically one way to look at this is that after we go over the reaction in the hemisphere, we also go over the reaction that European nations have as well, League of Nations has. We can look and see whether they are giving a red light, meaning stop, to the Axis powers of Japan, Italy, and Germany. They're giving a warning, which is the yellow light, or by their actions are they saying you should go forward because we're not going to stop you. So that's something that you can think of as we go through this. Here you see a cartoon of Japan leaving the League of Nations, internationalists going in, and Uncle Sam staying out, with this idea that Japan doesn't want any part of it. The United States never joined it, so it's hard to criticize Japan walking out. So events from 1930 to 1933. In 1931, Japan struggled with international politics. By 1930, Japan's regime was faltering under the pressure from nationalists and militarists who wanted to move forward with the idea of Asia for Asians. They wanted to move forward with this idea of autarky, which is this policy or idea that Japan would have its own resources, would have places where they could pull out resources like oil, metals, and other things. The United States has a lot of resources within its country. Japan is a much smaller country and is not as resource rich, and so they feel like they need to take over other nations in order to have this freedom that comes with acting that way. All right, right here you see the Japanese army marching into Manchuria, which is northern China, traditionally a different kingdom than China, but at this point it was actually part of China. Japan had dominated some of this area already, but by moving in with their army and taking it over completely, this was part of a move towards getting the resources that Japan wanted. Basically, Japan said a part of their railroad was bombed, which many people have come to the conclusion that they bombed it themselves. Then invaded to secure the railway, and Japan considered the coal and iron ore reserves of Manchuria vital to their survival. Japan's trade was stalled at 1929 because of just the international depression, and it showed Japan how dependent they were on other people's resources. So Japan invades Manchuria. China wants League action. Stimson refuses U.S. support of League sanctions, and the League doesn't. Although they talk about putting pressure on Japan, they don't. Stimson later realized he failed to rally any support for China with his actions, and probably should have acted earlier. In 1932, you see Hitler rise to power. At this point, there isn't much indication that Hitler is going to go through with any type of action or to invade the rest of Europe. His rise was popular in Germany as the order of fascism provided better than chaos they dealt with in the Depression. Germany's economy completely collapsed, and Hitler took over, created a strong central government, and began to help bring about economic recovery by spending on the military. But he did bring about this kind of recovery, and so people are looking at people in Germany rise to power, he uses the Treaty of Versailles and a lot of the punishments and embarrassment of World War I to rally Germans to the national cause, and will eventually use this as a reason for going to war. 1933, Japan leaves the League of Nations. There's no sanctions or any punishment for leaving. Very few people deal with or respond to Hitler's power in 1932. 1933, Hitler becomes dictator in 1933, takes full power of Germany. Brazil signs a trade agreement with Germany in 1934, and Senator Nye, who is a isolationist, holds hearings in the U.S. in 1934. You might ask why, basically to look at why the United States got into World War I. Now, why 14 years after the end of the war, actually 16 years since the fighting stopped, would you now talk about why the U.S. got into war? I think with Hitler's rise to power, Japan's invasion of Manchuria, I think the writing is on the wall that there might be another war, and Senator Nye and others are trying to put in place measures or ideas that would then prevent the U.S. from going to war. That's often the times why you hold hearings as a way to do that. 1935, Hitler renounces all sections of the Treaty of Versailles. European powers made some verbal complaints but took no action. He actually goes into areas that were the industrial areas of the Rhineland and other places, and begins to start building war materials, and starts raising a large army, which was all prevented by the Treaty of Versailles, but nobody enforces it. Canada, actually, Mackenzie King goes and meets with Hitler in 1935, says that he was a great, powerful leader, thought it was good for Germany, which obviously doesn't come to fruition. Right here you see Hitler riding the backs of the spineless leaders of democracy, often what's called appeasement, where you try and give Hitler what he wants, and therefore he will stop his actions. It's often, looked at as a toddler who goes to the grocery store and wants a candy bar, wants a little toy, and when they don't get that toy, they're in the grocery line, everybody's there, the checker's there, there's a line there, they throw a fit. And the parent, if they want to appease that child to get the fit to stop, they buy the good. The problem is that the next time that child wants that good, they know exactly how to get it. I'm not sure if the person that designed those front of the grocery stores really had parents in mind on that one. He's not a favorite of mine. Events from 1935 to 1936. Mussolini invades Ethiopia. This is called the Abyssinian Crisis, and it was one of the major crises of the League of Nations. The U.S. actions, Neutrality Act of 1935 and 36. So the U.S. responds by passing Neutrality Acts. We will look at those a little bit more tomorrow, but in 1935, they passed a Neutrality Act that prohibited American ships from carrying war material to belligerent nations, prohibited the United States basically from being able to do that. It also recommended that American citizens be warned against traveling on belligerent ships, and said that if you do travel on a ship, it is at your own risk, and the U.S. government will not try and get you reparations or to rescue you from that, but that is something that you choose. Roosevelt at first praised the measure, but later really expressed annoyance regarding the restrictions of the Neutrality Act of 1935. The Neutrality Act of 1936 was another response, and this really was about loans and giving credits. That the United States, at the president's discretion, could still give commercial credits, but for the most part was to stay out of any types of loans, large credit to any belligerents, so that the U.S. would not get into war. We can see that in 1935, the U.S. got into war they concluded because of submarine warfare and because of the constant giving of arms to Great Britain. So this would prevent the United States from siding with one side or the other, and also would keep or recommend that people don't travel on belligerent ships to keep them away from going to war because of submarine warfare again. So Standard Oil and other U.S. companies sold goods to Italy. So the Abyssinian crisis, let's talk a bit about that, back up here a little bit, is Mussolini invades Ethiopia. Mussolini is the fascist leader of Italy. He rises to power about the same time as Hitler does. And he decides that what Italy needs to do is go back to the Roman Empire days, where they dominated all of the Mediterranean. Well, in looking around, some of them are French colonies. He doesn't want to pick a fight with France. Egypt is a British colony, doesn't want to pick a fight with Great Britain. But there's good old Ethiopia, not protected by any European powers. It's an independent African nation, and he decides to start there. So he sends his tanks and planes down, and they invade Ethiopia. One of the major interests that Italy needs is oil. Now, that is not covered by the Neutrality Act of 1935, and so Standard Oil and other U.S. companies sold oil to Italy. FDR calls for a moral embargo. He doesn't try to enact the Neutrality Acts. He doesn't come back and say, hey, you can't, or ban or embargo towards Italy. He just says we shouldn't give Italy oil or other goods, but U.S. companies don't follow suit. Actually, Canada had a leader called R.B. Bennett from 1930, where he took over because people felt like King wasn't doing enough for the Depression, until 1935, when this happens. And so he gave R.D. Riddle, who was the person for Canada who went to the League of Nations, he told him to go ahead to call for sanctions on Italy on orders from Bennett. Riddle doesn't go back to King and ask for what he wants. King is a man who avoids conflict at any point. He's worried that the French Catholics won't like Canada going against Italy because of the Pope and the Roman Catholic tradition. And so he basically is split on this idea. In 1936, he travels to Geneva and gives a speech saying Canada will not go to war for the League, and they won't necessarily support these sanctions. They won't go to war against Italy. And basically, he pulls back Canada's support for an embargo. So, again, we can see that there's some warning here from King, but most of this is, and some warning from FDR. But you could see that Italy invades another country. The League is powerless, or the League does not stop it. The U.S. does not stop it. Canada does not get involved. And Italy is pretty much given the green light to continue its war against Ethiopia. So events from 1935 to 36, we have a few more minutes, so we're going to do this slide here and then I'll be done. 1936, you have the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War was between the fascists on one side and the leftists on the others. The leftists are people that believe in democracy, and the communists. And so you got the two sides. The U.S. added civil wars to the Neutrality Acts of 1936 because of Hitler and Italy's support of the fascists in Spain. They actually get an upper hand. The Russians do give some support to the leftists, but the United States really tries to stay out of it. They add civil wars to their neutrality acts so that they can't trade goods. There is a group of called the Lincoln Brigade of U.S. Volunteers, but they actually are not sanctioned by the U.S. government to be a part of the Spanish Civil War. Mexico gives aid to the leftists. Cardenas, who has some socialist, communist leanings, gives aid to the leftists in the war, gives military aid. The United States actually is not very happy with Cardenas about this because he's also supporting enemies of the United States as well. And so he eventually kind of stops, but this definitely shows that that Mexico was getting involved, that other people were getting involved. And Roosevelt calls for the Buenos Aires Peace Conference to promote peace. This basically shows that the United States is really not taking any interest in the Spanish Civil War or helping out or doing anything like this. And then in 1936 as well, Italy walks out of the League of Nations, leaves the League, and basically says that we do not want to be a part of the League anymore. U.S. actions, they have another Neutrality Act in 1937, which bans anybody from traveling on foreign ships, makes it illegal for them to travel on foreign ships, and also prohibits American ships from carrying any war material whatsoever. However, 1937 does say, and any kind of material at all, that it is okay for the U.S. to trade non-war goods with countries that are fighting at war, because what they're worried about is that if war does break out, they need to have something in there that says it's okay to still trade with belligerent nations and do some commercial credits, but to not go beyond that. All right, that's the end of our podcast.